and welcome back to Family Law. I'd like to spend some time tonight talking about divorce, annulment, and legal separation. We're going to go into more detail about these topics in later classes, but it's important that you have a basic understanding of these topics before we move further into the course. As many of you know, I have a family law practice, and I think one of the best ways to train paralegals is to give them real-life examples of what paralegals do. So we're going to start with a hypothetical. A client comes into our office for some advice. We've already interviewed her, so we know she's very unhappy in her marriage, but she's not sure she wants to get a divorce. She's convinced her husband never loved her and only married her to make his family happy. He was 50 years old, a confirmed bachelor, when they got married. She was 40 years old and terrified she'd never get married, so she jumped at the chance, despite the fact she had some misgivings. They've been married for 3 years, but they've lived completely separate lives the entire time, except for the 3 times they've had sex. She'd like to know her legal options. In particular, she'd like to know if she can get an annulment rather than go through the painful process of a divorce. What I'd like you to do is to draft a letter to the client and explain the basic differences between divorce, annulment, and legal separation, and give her some idea of whether an annulment is a possibility. So take a few moments and jot down some notes. I'm going to call on several of you to share with me your ideas. Okay, Sandra, we'll start with you. Does our client have grounds for an annulment?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, both of them were old enough to get married. Neither of them had ever been married before, so I don't think bigamy is a possible ground. The only question I have is whether she could claim that he had committed some kind of fraud if he had told her that he wanted children and then later on decided that he never really wanted to consummate the marriage or to live together. But we don't really know if he ever told her that, do we?
Correct. We don't really know if he misrepresented his intent to have children. But if he did tell her after they were married that he didn't want to have children, or that he really didn't want to consummate the marriage, could she still get an annulment after 3 years?
I think it would be pretty tough. Our text says that if the partner who wants the annulment found out about the misrepresentation and then still decided to stay in the marriage, that they would then be actually ratifying the marriage.
Exactly. I don't really think this is the best choice for our client. Does she have any other option short of divorce?
Well, she could get a legal separation. Although it sounds like they aren't really living together as it is.
Well, then what would be the advantages of a legal separation?
She could remain married, and maybe it would get the guy's attention if he knew that she was considering a divorce.
Okay, but what about the couple's finances? Could either of the parties just disappear with all the money?
No, because there would be a court order preventing that. However, if she needed financial support, she could request that from the court.
Would she have to have grounds for the legal separation?
Not in our state. We have no-fault divorces, and she could just say that they didn't get along. But she could claim emotional and mental distress from being forced to live apart.
Correct. Basically, a legal separation buys some time. If this couple had children, the court would make a determination as to temporary child custody and award some temporary child support. In my experience, clients who get a legal separation usually go on and get a divorce. But for some, this option affords them an opportunity to cool off or rethink their decision.
Well, I think she should just file for divorce. I mean, obviously, this guy doesn't want to be married in the traditional sense. And if she's legally separated, she can't move on with her life. I mean, if she meets somebody else, she can't date them because she's still married. And like Sandra said, we have no-fault divorce in this state, so she could reasonably argue that they have irreconcilable differences and have been living separate and apart. Our state law says that a couple only has to be separated at least 6 months. I think they've definitely met that standard.
That's right, Greg. Divorce legally dissolves the marriage. It settles all questions about the couple's property and money. If there are children of the marriage, the court will determine custody and support. Then the parties are free to remarry. What if our state had fault divorce? What are some of the common grounds?
Adultery, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Desertion or abandonment, that's the second ground. Although in this case, I don't think that would work because the separation has to be without the consent of the other spouse, and these two have been living voluntarily in separate homes. For years, cruelty was the most common grounds for divorce. It could mean that one of the spouses was physically abusive, or it could include acts of mental cruelty.
So, our client basically has two options: legal separation or divorce. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is draft that letter to the client and summarize our discussion. We'll see you next week in class. Thank you.